Receptionist Racist Karen humiliates Shaquille O'Neal without knowing that he is the owner of the hotel. The late autumn rain fell steadily over Paris as Shaquille O'Neal's modest rental car pulled up to the entrance of Le Grand Lumière, one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Despite his legendary status in the basketball world, tonight he was deliberately dressed down in simple clothing, a plain hoodie and comfortable jeans, part of his careful plan to evaluate the hotel he had secretly acquired. At 7'1", Shaq was used to commanding attention wherever he went, but tonight his posture was deliberately understated, his famous smile tucked away behind a thoughtful expression. Years of business experience had taught him that true insight into establishment's culture came not from announced visits and rehearsed presentations, but from experiencing it as an ordinary guest. The doorman's slight hesitation before opening the door didn't escape Shaq's notice. Neither did the quick glance exchanged between the bellhop and the security guard, a silent conversation that spoke volumes about their initial judgments. But it was the reaction of the front desk receptionist that would set the tone for what was to come. The receptionist stood behind the marble counter, her platinum blonde hair pulled into an immaculate chignon, her designer uniform pressed to perfection. Her carefully manicured fingers paused over the keyboard as she took in the sight of the tall figure approaching her desk. Her lips, painted in an expensive shade of coral, twitched slightly with disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her French accent thick with poorly concealed contempt. Shaquille smiled warmly, maintaining his composure. "Good evening. I have a reservation." The receptionist made a show of typing on her computer, her acrylic nails clicking against the keys with exaggerated force. "I'm not seeing any reservation. Are you quite sure you have the right hotel? Le Grand Lumière is a luxury establishment, and our rates start at—" She paused for effect. "Well, perhaps I should direct you to some more suitable accommodations in the tourist district." The subtle insult wasn't lost on Shaq, who had faced similar prejudices throughout his life, even after achieving tremendous success both on and off the court. "Please check again," he said calmly. "The reservation was made 3 days ago." With an exaggerated sigh, she made another cursory attempt at searching. "Ah, yes, I see it now. However, given our establishment's standards, we require an additional security deposit from certain guests. I'm sure you understand." In the lobby, other guests and staff members pretended not to watch the exchange, but their furtive glances betrayed their interest. Among them, a young staff member observed with obvious discomfort, her hands fidgeting with the guest information packets she was organizing. Shaq reached for his wallet, maintaining his dignity despite the humiliation being forced upon him. "Of course, how much would that be?" €3,000, she replied with a smirk, clearly expecting this amount to send him running for the door. Without hesitation, Shaquille produced his credit card. "That won't be a problem." For a moment, the receptionist's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. She hadn't expected him to agree so readily. Taking his card, she processed the deposit with slightly less enthusiasm than before. As she handed him the key to what was clearly one of the hotel's less desirable rooms, Shaq caught sight of something interesting. Behind her desk, partially visible on her computer screen, was an email about the hotel's recent acquisition by a mysterious investment group. His investment group, though she had no way of knowing that. "Your room is on the 3rd floor, she announced curtly. "The elevator is to your left. Breakfast is served from 7 to 10 a.m., although—" She paused, looking him up and down once more. "The dress code is strictly enforced." Shaquille accepted the key with a gracious nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying no trace of the authority he could have wielded. "I appreciate your thorough attention to detail." As he walked toward the elevator, he could hear her whispered comments to a nearby bellhop, something about the hotel's standards slipping. But his mind was already working on something else. He had seen enough in those few minutes to understand that Le Grand Lumière needed more than just a change in ownership. It needed a complete cultural transformation. In his room, which was indeed one of the hotel's less luxurious offerings, Shaq sat down at the small desk and opened his laptop. The email he composed was brief, but would set in motion a series of events that would shake the foundation of Le Grand Lumiere's carefully maintained facade of exclusivity. What the prejudiced receptionist and the others didn't know was that their new owner was not just any investor. He was someone who understood the true meaning of dignity, respect, and excellence. The following morning, Shaquille O'Neal made his way to the hotel's celebrated breakfast room. Despite the early hour, the space was already filled with well-heeled guests in designer clothing, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum beneath the crystal chandeliers. As he entered wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks, the maitre d' visibly hesitated before reluctantly showing him to a table in the far corner, partially hidden behind a large potted plant. From his strategic position, Shaq could observe the entire room while remaining relatively inconspicuous as a 7'1" former NBA star could be. He watched as the same blonde receptionist from the previous night, who apparently doubled as the breakfast room supervisor during peak hours, directed her staff with imperial authority. Her treatment of guests varied dramatically based on their appearance. Effusive warmth for those dripping in luxury brands, barely concealed contempt for those she deemed unworthy of Le Grand Lumiere's prestigious reputation. But it was her interaction with the staff that truly caught Shaquille's attention. The way she commanded her subordinates reminded him of the countless times he'd witnessed similar behavior in establishments worldwide, a toxic culture that needed to be transformed from the ground up. A young staff member entered the breakfast room with a stack of updated menu cards. As she approached the receptionist to ask where to place them, the older woman's response was sharp enough to make nearby guests pause their conversations. "Really? During peak breakfast service? Your timing is as poor as your attention to detail. Put them in the back and get out of my sight. And fix your hair. This isn't some roadside cafe." The young woman's cheeks flushed as she hurried away, but not before Shaq noticed her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the menus. Several other staff members quickly averted their eyes, their body language speaking volumes about the daily reality of working under this regime. As he sipped his coffee, Shaquille observed more subtle dynamics at play. A middle-aged couple, dressed comfortably but not extravagantly, was seated at a table far from the windows, despite the dining room being half empty. A young family with children was treated to loud sighs and eye rolls from the receptionist every time their toddler made the slightest noise. Meanwhile, a group of obviously wealthy guests were doted upon, their every whim catered to with obsequious enthusiasm. During a quiet moment, Shaq caught sight of an interaction that particularly troubled him. An elderly housekeeper was struggling with a heavy service cart in the hallway just outside the breakfast room. When she asked for assistance, the receptionist's response was both immediate and crushing. "That's your job, madame. If you can't handle your duties at your age, perhaps it's time to consider retirement." The words were delivered with a smile, but the cruelty behind them was unmistakable. Shaquille watched as a young waiter waited until the receptionist was distracted, then quietly slipped out to help the housekeeper. This small act of kindness, performed in secret for fear of reprimand, spoke volumes about the culture of fear that had taken root in the hotel. Throughout the morning, Shaq continued his careful observation of the hotel's operations. Every interaction, every subtle gesture, every whispered comment painted a clearer picture of an establishment that had lost its way. The grandeur of Le Grand Lumiere's physical appearance masked a workplace culture that had become toxic and discriminatory. Back in his room, Shaquille began making notes on his laptop. The email he had sent the previous night had set things in motion. But now he had a clearer picture of what needed to be done. The hotel's problems ran deeper than one difficult employee. They were systemic, creating an environment where fear and prejudice had replaced the true spirit of hospitality. As he worked, he could hear the receptionist's voice drifting up from the lobby below, berating another staff member for some perceived infraction. Soon, very soon, she would learn that appearances can be deceiving, and that true luxury has nothing to do with designer labels or social status. But first, Shaquille O'Neal needed to understand every aspect of how this once great hotel had lost its way, and how he, as its new owner, would restore not just its reputation but its soul. Over the next few days, Shaquille O'Neal immersed himself in the daily life of Le Grand Lumiere. carefully documenting every interaction and pattern he observed. His height and presence, which normally commanded immediate recognition, now served as a perfect catalyst for revealing the true nature of the hotel's toxic culture. Every dismissive glance, every whispered comment, every instance of discriminatory treatment became another piece of evidence in his growing case for change. During an afternoon in the hotel's elegant lobby, Shaq struck up a conversation with Thomas, one of the younger bellhops who had shown genuine kindness to guests regardless of their appearance. The young man was initially hesitant to speak openly, but Shaquille's warm demeanor and authentic interest gradually put him at ease. "It wasn't always like this," Thomas confided in a low voice, glancing around to ensure the blonde receptionist wasn't within earshot. Le Grand Lumière used to be known for its warmth, not just its luxury. But ever since she became head of guest services 3 years ago, everything changed. She convinced the previous owners that exclusivity meant excluding people. Shaq nodded, thoughtfully, remembering similar situations he'd encountered throughout his career, both in basketball and business. "How do the other staff members handle it?" he asked, careful to maintain his role as a simple guest. Thomas's expression darkened. "Many good people have left. Those who stayed. We try to help each other when we can, but it's difficult. She has eyes everywhere, and any complaint against her somehow ends up making things worse for the person who spoke up." Their conversation was interrupted by the sharp click of heels on marble. The receptionist appeared, her eyes narrowing as she saw Thomas engaged in conversation with the guest she deemed unworthy of the hotel's full hospitality. "Thomas, surely there are bags that need attending to." Her voice dripped with artificial sweetness. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to work the night shift for the rest of the month." The young man quickly excused himself, leaving Shaquille alone in the lobby. But the brief conversation had confirmed what he'd suspected. The hotel's problems stemmed from a leadership that had confused luxury with elitism, service with servitude. Later that evening, Shaq discreetly observed a group of staff members gathering in the employee break room. The blonde receptionist had just finished berating a young housekeeper for using the guest elevator when the service elevator was temporarily out of order. The girl, barely holding back tears, was being consoled by her colleagues. "Don't let her get to you, Marie," an older staff member whispered. "She treats everyone this way. Staff, guests, anyone she thinks isn't good enough for her precious hotel." "But why doesn't anyone stop her?" Marie asked, wiping her eyes. "Surely the owners must know." The older woman sighed. The previous owners never cared as long as the wealthy guests were happy, and now with the new ownership, well, who knows? What will change? Shaquille felt a familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Throughout his career, he had faced and overcome prejudice through a combination of dignity, determination, and strategic action. Now, as the owner of Le Grand Lumière, he had the power to effect real change, but he knew that simply firing one person wouldn't address the systemic issues that had taken root. During dinner service, he watched as the receptionist continued her campaign of subtle discrimination. A family celebrating their daughter's graduation was seated near the kitchen despite the dining room being half empty. A businessman in a modest suit was subjected to excessive questioning about his reservation. Meanwhile, a group of clearly wealthy guests were fawned over, their every whim catered to with excessive enthusiasm. What struck Shaq most was how the staff had developed an underground network of mutual support. When the receptionist wasn't looking, they would quietly help each other, warn each other of her approach, and find small ways to make things better for guests who had been treated poorly. It was a testament to their resilience, but also a sad reflection of how toxic the environment had become. As he returned to his room that night, Shaquille began formulating a plan. The email he had sent on his first night had set certain things in motion, and soon it would be time to reveal his true identity. But first, he needed to ensure that when change came, it would be comprehensive and lasting. Opening his laptop, he began composing a detailed report of everything he had witnessed. Each incident, each conversation, each example of discrimination and abuse of power was carefully documented. But more importantly, he also noted the countless small acts of kindness and solidarity among the staff, the true spirit of hospitality that had somehow survived despite everything. Tomorrow would bring new observations and insights, but Shaquille O'Neal was already certain of one thing. Le Grand Lumière needed more than just a change in management. It needed a complete reformation of its values and culture. And he was exactly the person to make it happen. The morning of his 5th day at Le Grand Lumière dawned with a sense of anticipation. Shaquille O'Neal had spent the previous evening making final preparations for what would become a pivotal day in the hotel's history. His careful observations and documentation had painted a clear picture of an establishment in desperate need of transformation. During breakfast, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. Staff members seemed more nervous than usual, whispering among themselves when the blonde receptionist wasn't looking. It didn't take long for him to discover why. A notice had been posted in the staff room announcing a mandatory all-hands meeting scheduled for that afternoon. "It must be about the new ownership," he overheard one waiter whisper to another. "Maybe things will finally change." "Or get worse," his colleague replied grimly. "You know how she always manages to come out on top." The receptionist herself seemed particularly agitated, barking orders with even more venom than usual. When a guest accidentally spilled coffee on the pristine marble floor, her reaction was disproportionately harsh. "This is exactly what happens when we lower our standards," she announced loudly, making sure everyone in the vicinity could hear. This establishment used to have a certain caliber of clientele, but lately, her eyes drifted meaningfully toward Shaquille's corner table. Throughout the morning, Shaq watched as she seemed to take out her anxiety on everyone around her. A young bellhop was reduced to tears for missing a spot while polishing the brass fixtures. An elderly couple was told their reservation might be lost if they couldn't produce additional identification. Each incident was another stone added to the mountain of evidence he had been collecting. As the afternoon approached, Shaquille made his way to his room to prepare for the meeting. He changed into a crisp suit that had been carefully hidden in his luggage, no longer the simple clothes he had worn to test the hotel's true character. Looking in the mirror, he straightened his tie and thought about the journey that had brought him here. From his days as a basketball legend to his successful business career, Shaquille O'Neal had always believed in the power of respect, dignity, and equal treatment. The discrimination he had faced during his stay at Le Grand Lumière wasn't just about him. It was about a systemic problem that affected countless guests and employees. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the hotel's grand ballroom. As staff members began filing in, the nervous energy was palpable. The receptionist stationed herself near the front, her platinum blonde hair and impeccable uniform a stark contrast to the more modest appearance of most employees. "Whatever happens," she was saying loudly to anyone within earshot, "we must maintain our standards. I've worked too hard to establish the proper tone for this establishment to see it undermined by changing times." Shaquille waited in a small anteroom, listening as the ballroom filled with murmured conversations and speculation about what was to come. Through the partly opened door, he could see the receptionist holding court, clearly confident that whatever changes were coming, she would emerge unscathed as she had so many times before. What she didn't know was that everything was about to change. In his hand, Shaq held a folder containing printouts of every incident he had documented over the past 5 days. But more importantly, he held the power to transform Le Grand Lumière from a symbol of exclusivity and discrimination into a true example of luxury hospitality, where every guest and employee was treated with the dignity they deserved. As the clock struck 3, a hotel administrator stepped up to the podium, clearing his throat nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here today. As you know, Le Grand Lumière has recently undergone a change in ownership. Today we have the privilege of meeting our new owner, who has spent the past several days getting to know our establishment." The receptionist's confident smile began to falter as the administrator's words sank in. In the back of the room, several staff members exchanged knowing looks, beginning to understand why certain recent events had unfolded as they had. Shaquille O'Neal took a deep breath, straightened his tie one final time, and prepared to step through the door. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the opportunity to show that true luxury isn't about exclusivity or discrimination. It's about dignity, respect, and the genuine spirit of hospitality. A hush fell over the grand ballroom of Le Grand Lumière as Shaquille O'Neal stepped through the door and made his way to the podium. The collective gasp was audible as staff members recognized the simple guest who had been subjected to such disdain over the past 5 days. But it was the blonde receptionist's face that underwent the most dramatic transformation, her confident smile crumbling into an expression of dawning horror. "Good afternoon, everyone," Shaq began, his voice carrying the same warmth and dignity he had maintained throughout his stay, even in the face of discrimination. "For those who haven't recognized me yet, I'm Shaquille O'Neal, and as of last week, I'm the new owner of Le Grand Lumière." The silence in the room deepened. In the front row, the receptionist's face had gone pale, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Over the past 5 days, I've experienced this hotel not as a celebrity, not as an owner, but as a guest who was judged solely on appearances. What I've witnessed has been both disappointing and enlightening." He opened the folder in front of him, though he hardly needed to reference its contents. Every incident was clearly etched in his memory. "I've seen guests treated differently based on their clothing, their appearance, or their perceived wealth. I've watched staff members hide their natural warmth and hospitality out of fear of reprimand. I've observed as artificial standards of luxury were used to justify discrimination and disrespect." Several staff members nodded slowly, while others cast sideways glances at the receptionist, who sat rigidly in her chair, her earlier arrogance completely evaporated. "But I've also seen something remarkable," Shaq continued, his voice warming. "I've witnessed the true spirit of hospitality surviving despite everything. I've seen staff members helping each other in secret, finding ways to make guests feel welcome, despite being ordered to do otherwise. That spirit, that genuine care for others, is the real luxury that sets a great hotel apart." He turned, his attention directly to the receptionist, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "When I arrived, I was told this hotel wasn't for people like me. I was charged an extra deposit, given a lesser room, and treated with consistent disdain, not because of any action on my part, but because of predetermined judgments about who belonged here and who didn't." The receptionist attempted to speak, but Shaquille raised his hand gently. "This isn't about public humiliation or revenge. This is about transformation. True luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel valued and respected." He turned back to address the entire room. "Starting today, things will change at Le Grand Lumière. We will implement new training programs focused on inclusive hospitality. Every staff member will be evaluated on their ability to make all guests feel welcome, regardless of their appearance or status. The artificial barriers and discriminatory practices end now." Looking around the room, Shaq could see hope dawning in many faces. The young staff members who had been afraid to show kindness openly were sitting straighter. The older employees who had witnessed the hotel's decline were nodding in approval. To those who have maintained their humanity and kindness despite pressure to do otherwise, thank you. You are the heart of this hotel, and you will be integral to its transformation. To those who have perpetuated or enabled discrimination, his eyes flickered briefly to the receptionist, you have a choice to make. Either embrace this new direction and learn to treat every person with dignity, or find employment elsewhere. The receptionist, her face flushed with embarrassment, finally found her voice. "But the standards, the exclusivity, that's what makes us special." Shaquille shook his head gently. "No, what makes a hotel special is how it makes people feel. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect. That's the true meaning of luxury hospitality." Over the next hour, Shaq outlined his vision for the hotel's future. New training programs would be implemented. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination would be established. Employee feedback would be actively sought and valued. The culture of fear would be replaced with one of mutual respect and genuine hospitality. As the meeting concluded, staff members approached him one by one, many with tears in their eyes, sharing their own stories and expressing their hope for the future. The receptionist remained in her seat, the reality of her actions and their consequences finally sinking in. In the days that followed, Le Grand Lumière began its transformation. The receptionist, faced with the choice between change and departure, surprisingly chose to stay and learn. Under Shaquille's guidance, she began the difficult process of examining her prejudices and transforming her approach to hospitality. The hotel's reputation grew not just for its luxurious accommodations, but for its genuine warmth and inclusive atmosphere. Guests from all walks of life were welcomed with equal respect and dignity. The staff, freed from the burden of artificial discrimination, let their natural hospitality shine. Shaquille O'Neal had achieved what he set out to do, not just changing a policy or replacing a person, but transforming an entire culture. Le Grand Lumière became a shining example of true luxury hospitality, where the measure of excellence was not in exclusivity, but in the dignity and respect with which every person was treated.